everyone. Welcome. We're delighted to have you all here. I'm Crystal Logan, Director of Community Programs here at the Aspen Institute. The objective of our community programs is to provide the Roaring Fork Valley access to the Aspen Institute programs and to also create programs that highlight the work that we're doing around the world. So this event really exemplifies that goal. Kent Ervin is the director of the Aspen Institute Homeland Security Policy Program based in D.C., whose mission is to heighten public awareness as to the nation's continued vulnerability to terrorism and to persuade the nation to take the necessary steps to close the gap between how secure we should be and how secure we actually are. Clark was the Inspector General of the State Department from 2001 to 2003 and of the Department of Homeland Security from 2003 to 2004. Clark's service in the administration of President George W. Bush is preceded by his service as the Associate Director of Policy in the White House Office of National Service in the administration of President George H.W. Bush. In addition to his work at the Aspen Institute, Clark is a member of the Wartime Commission on Afghanistan and Iraq. He is an occasional on-air analyst for CNN and MSNBC, focusing on Homeland Security, national security, and intelligence issues. He's frequently cited as an expert on these matters by national and international publications, including the New York Times and the Washington Post. His book on Homeland Security, titled Open Target, Where America is Vulnerable to Attack, was published in 2006. He earned a BA degree cum laude in government from Harvard, an MA degree in politics, philosophy, and economics from Oxford University as a Rhodes Scholar, and a JD degree cum laude from Harvard Law School. His program is hosting the Aspen Security Forum this summer in late June in Aspen, and it will feature today's top security experts in our country and is open to the public. So we have flyers that we will have available for all of you as you leave if you're interested in that. Clark will speak for about 30 minutes, and then we'll take questions from all of you. So with that, it's an honor to have Clark with us today, and please join me in welcoming him. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Crystal. Well, thank you very much, Crystal. Let me see if I can put this back in. There we go. Great. Well, I'm delighted to be here with you all. It's always terrific for those of us who work in Aspen, Washington, to come to the real Aspen Institute here in Aspen. And today has been a day of variable weather, as we all know. It seems to me appropriate, given the gravity of the topic, that the clouds have come back in and the fog has settled back in as we gather to talk about a sobering topic like Homeland Security and counterterrorism. I'm grateful to all of you for being here. Needless to say, given what I do and what roles I've played in government, that I think this issue of Homeland Security and counterterrorism is the most important issue facing the country today. There are, needless to say, any number of issues competing for the nation's attention. Washington's attention today, of course, is riveted on the health care legislation, which was signed into law today. Whether one supports it or opposes it, there's no question but that it's a major issue. And there are other issues, as I say, education, immigration, of course, the still fragile state of the economy and the still stubbornly high unemployment rate. But as I say, to me anyway, the most important issue is that of Homeland Security and counterterrorism. And that comes home to us Americans only when, of course, there is a terror attack, as there was on 9/11, or when there is the threat of one, as there was on Christmas Day. The challenge, it seems to me, is for Americans to keep in mind the threat of terrorism on a constant basis, because the threat is a constant one. So with that, by way of a predicate, let me get into the substance of my talk. And as you heard from Crystal, to whom I'm grateful for that introduction, I'll speak relatively briefly so as to leave maximum time for questions and interaction with you in typical Aspen fashion. As you heard, I was the first Inspector General of the Department of Homeland Security, present at the creation of the department. I started my second career in Washington. I served, as you heard briefly, in the first Bush administration, George H.W. Bush. I had an opportunity to serve in the second Bush administration on the foreign policy side. Foreign policy and national security had been my academic focus at college and in graduate school, and I always wanted to have an opportunity to work on the foreign policy side of the government, and I had that opportunity in 2001 when Colin Powell, then our Secretary of State, asked me to be the State Department Inspector General. I formed a very, very close working relationship with Secretary Powell, for whom I had tremendous regard and admiration, almost a father-son-like relationship, actually. I mention that simply to say that when I got the call in the fall of 2002 from the White House Personnel Office saying that in the White House's judgment I'd done a good job for those 2 years nearly as State Department Inspector General, such a good job that they were asking me to leave and to be the first Inspector General of this then soon-to-be formed new Department of Homeland Security, I spent a few sleepless nights thinking about whether I should accept that opportunity. On the one hand, needless to say, I felt it was my obligation, once asked by the President, to serve in any capacity regarding Homeland Security and counterterrorism, given the devastating impact of those attacks, which were still fresh in all Americans' memory and certainly my own. On the other hand, I just started at the State Department, was beginning to make progress, and as I said, formed this terrifically close working relationship with the Secretary himself, and could only wonder whether I might have the same working relationship with the new leadership of the new Department of Homeland Security. Be that as it may, we know how this story came out. I did accept the call. I did become the first Inspector General of the Department of Homeland Security. And in that capacity, I might step back to just explain briefly what an Inspector General does. I confess that I didn't really have a clear sense of that when I was asked to be the State Department Inspector General. In brief, the Inspector General is, of course, appointed by a president and therefore presumably shares, generally speaking anyway, the politics, the ideology, the party affiliation of the president who appointed him or her. But once appointed, once confirmed by the Senate, the Inspector General is to take off his or her partisan ideological hat and to thereafter be an independent, neutral observer and analyst of how well or how poorly a given department was carrying out its mission. In the case of the Department of Homeland Security, of course, carrying out the mission of protecting the United States from another devastating terror attack like 9/11. In my rather brief tenure at DHS, and the briefness of it, the brevity of it, is a story in itself, I found gaping holes in America's security in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. And I brought those gaping holes to the attention of the management of this new department, and generalizing to make the point, rather than a desire, a determination to close those security gaps, all too often I found on the part of the department's leaders an indifference to the gaping security holes I found, a laissez-faire attitude that left America still more vulnerable to terror attacks. Let me cite just one quick example, then I'll bring us up to date as to where we are today. In the immediate aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, President Bush did something unusual, if not unique, and that is he himself asked the Inspector General, the then Inspector General of the Department of Transportation, in whose jurisdiction, right after 9/11, aviation security lay, to undertake with his team of investigators and auditors a series of undercover investigations at airports large and small throughout our country to test the ability of the then still privatized screener workforce to spot concealed guns and knives and explosives hidden either in the carry-on luggage or on the persons, on the bodies of these undercover investigators. And those investigators were sent out and they went to these airports, they carried out these covert tests called penetration tests. And the very first substantive briefing that I was given as the Inspector General in January of 2003 was a briefing from the Inspector General as to what his team found 2 years earlier in 2001. In brief, his team found that even in the immediate aftermath of the attacks, when America's alert levels were literally and figuratively, one would have thought, at their highest, it was still far easier than it ought to have been to sneak those deadly weapons through. And so the very first task that I gave to my team of inspectors and auditors, many of whom I had inherited from the Department of Transportation when the responsibility for aviation security was transferred from transportation to this new Department of Homeland Security, was to go back 2 years later to those same airports, large and small, to test whether the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, the transfer of aviation security responsibility from the Department of Homeland Security, from the Department of Transportation to the Department of Homeland Security, and most importantly, whether the federalization of the screener workforce had made any difference in screeners' ability to spot these concealed weapons. The results, all these many years later, 7 years later, are still classified, but suffice it to say that the results that we obtained 2 years later were exactly the same to the decimal point as they were in the days and weeks following 9/11. Fast forward to today and to the subject of today's talk. Essentially, the subject of today's talk, as you know, is 9 years after 9/11, nearly. Are we safer than we were on 9/11? The short answer to that question is yes, we are absolutely safer than we were on 9/11. And that's particularly true in the aviation sector. We Americans tend to always fight the last war, and therefore it is understandable that we would have, and have done, spent the bulk of our resources and focused the bulk of our time and attention since 9/11 on the aviation sector because, of course, that was the means through which we were attacked on 9/11. We've spent upwards of $30 billion on aviation security since 9/11, and we have something to show for it, as all of us air travelers know. Cockpit doors are hardened. One could waltz into the flight deck on 9/11. That is no longer possible. Some pilots are armed and some flight attendants as well. The number of air marshals on 9/11 covering the whole country was 11. The number today is classified, but it numbers in the thousands. Still too few, but thousands as opposed to 11. And of course, passengers are much more sensitized to the critical role that they can play before another would-be terrorist brings down an airplane. We should be reminded that on Christmas Day, it was Abdul Muttalib's own incompetence and passengers' courage and bravery that averted that terror attack, not any efforts of counterterrorism officials in Washington. And yet the bad news is that in my judgment, whether we are safer today than we were on 9/11 is not the only question, certainly. And in the scheme of things, it's not the most important question. The most important questions are we as safe as we can be? Are we as safe as we think we are? Are we as safe as we need to be? And the answer to those questions, sadly for the country, in my judgment, is no. And let me give you just a few examples in a number of areas, and then I'll have some concluding thoughts, and I'll open it up for questions. I want to go back to where I began in aviation security. I began there for a reason, because, as I say, we've done a lot in the aviation sector. But the bad news is we're still far weaker in the aviation sector than we should be all these many years after 9/11. Back to these undercover tests. Every year, if you read your newspapers carefully and if you watch your television news carefully, as I know you do, you will know, as I do, that every year the Inspector General, my successor at the Department of Homeland Security, GAO investigators and auditors, and media investigators undertake the very same kinds of tests that we did in 2003, and they still find it far easier to sneak these guns and knives and explosives through than it should be, and just as easy as it was on 9/11. And now, in the aftermath of the Abdul Muttalib case on Christmas Day, as you have read, there is this wholesale rush on the part of TSA to deploy the latest purported silver bullet to prevent another terrorist from blowing up an airplane, whole-body imaging machines. And I won't get into the details of those, but basically, as you've heard, they are see-through X-ray-like machines that can literally see through passengers' clothing to spot any concealed weapons on the body. The problem is that a couple of things. One, they are not automated explosive detectors. A person has to look at the image, has to notice that there's an anomaly, has to figure out what that anomaly is. So it is still possible. And further, those machines cannot detect explosives that are hidden within the bodily cavity, which of course is the next way in which terrorists are likely to exploit that vulnerability. You may not have noticed that last summer, in August of 2009, the Saudi counterterrorism minister, Prince Mohammed bin Nayef, was nearly assassinated by a terrorist using the exact same kind of explosive used on Christmas Day, and it was secreted in the body of the terrorist. These machines that are being deployed at airports all throughout the country today cannot detect that. And so if terrorists are determined to strike at the aviation sector, the technology that we are beginning to deploy cannot detect it. Another example, air cargo. Most of us, since we all fly passenger airplanes all the time, at one time or another have been on a plane in the cargo hold of which is some cargo. Unlike luggage, which post 9/11 is screened 100% for explosives, air cargo is not. That too is a gaping vulnerability that will ultimately be exploited by terrorists. The good news is there is legislation that was passed in 2007 that requires by this year, 3 years later, 2010, August of this year, 100% scanning of cargo for explosives. The bad news is that TSA admits it will not meet that deadline. It's only 60% of the way there. and thinks we have probably 2 more years to go before it gets the other 40% of the way. The question is whether terrorists will wait for 2 years before exploiting that vulnerability. So, to conclude this part of the talk, even in the aviation sector, where we've done the most, we're more vulnerable than we should be. A second sector, maritime security. I'm a political junkie, as I suspect most, if not all of you are too. So while we all followed the historic 2008 campaign, I'm sure, I likewise followed rather intensely the 2004 campaign. And of course, President Bush and Senator Kerry disagreed about everything, we know, except one thing. You may remember in the first debate, I think it was, the one on foreign policy solely, each was asked the same question: what is the greatest threat to the country? And each answered in exactly the same way: nuclear terrorism. And most experts agree that the likeliest way, there are any number of ways, but the likeliest way that terrorists could smuggle a nuclear weapon into our country would be aboard one of the 11 to 12 million cargo containers that comes into one of our 360 or so seaports every year. The good news is, again per that 2007 law I mentioned, we're beginning at our seaports around the country to scan incoming cargo containers for radiation. The bad news is neither the present generation technology that we have nor the next generation technology can distinguish between harmless radiation that naturally occurs in kitty litter and bananas and ceramic tile shipments and the harmful kind that can indicate the presence of a weapon of mass destruction. And while we saw in the 1940s, in that race with the Soviet Union to develop atomic weapons, the concentration of the minds of the best scientists and technologists in the country to win that race, and while we saw a like technological success in the 1960s in the race to put a man on the moon, we have yet to see the same technological focus and scientific focus on developing technology that can distinguish a harmful radiation and harmless radiation that could be a game changer that would kill so many more people than were killed on 9/11. Another example, mass transit security. We have seen a number of instances around the world. The London attacks in 2005 and 2007, the Madrid attacks in 2004, the Mumbai attacks in India 2 years ago, 2008, which point up the vulnerability of our own mass transit stations here in the United States to a terror attack. Mass transit is called mass transit for a reason, and that's because tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people take that mode of transportation in our most densely populated cities each day. It is a wonder that terrorists have yet to exploit that vulnerability because we've done virtually nothing to secure that sector. We've spent $1.5 billion on mass transit security versus $30 billion on aviation security. The good news is, after every scare, and we've seen a number of scares, as I mentioned, our cities, New York, Washington, D.C., others, do all the right things. We see an increased presence of police dogs and bomb-sniffing technology, surveillance cameras, and even random bag searches in New York and New Jersey. The bad news is that all these measures are ratcheted back when the threat appears to recede from the headlines, or does recede from the headlines. And if I were a terrorist, I'd simply wait until the threat recedes from the headlines before attacking. A quick word about border security. It is harder for foreign terrorists to enter the United States today, of course, than it was on 9/11, but not as hard as it should be. A couple of quick examples. There are a number of countries in the world, visa waiver countries, mostly in Europe, whose citizens don't need visas to enter the United States. The significance of that is, in the aftermath of 9/11, one of the recommendations that I made as the State Department Inspector General, visas are issued by the State Department, as you know, is that we interview 100%, or nearly 100%, of those from countries who need visas to enter the United States. If you're from Saudi Arabia or Pakistan or Egypt, say, countries about which we know there are terrorism concerns, then you have to apply in person at one of our embassies and consulates abroad. Only 3 of the 19 hijackers personally appeared for a visa application before 9/11. And your fingerprints are taken, a photograph is taken of you, that's captured, and you are interviewed by someone on our staff at an embassy or consulate who is trained in fraud detection techniques. Is that a guarantee that we will ferret out a terrorist before he comes to our shores? Of course not, but I would argue we're likelier to ferret out a terrorist if there is that kind of intensive scrutiny. And then, if that check is passed, once that person steps off the airplane here in the United States, the biometrics obtained abroad are confirmed against the biometrics taken at the port of entry to make sure that the person who applied abroad is the same person who's standing before the customs officer. That's quite a check. By way of contrast, if you come to the United States on a passport from Britain or France or Italy, etc., the only encounter that the United States government has with you before you're blithely allowed into our country is when you are talked to by the customs inspector literally for seconds. They're under great pressure to clear these international flights over the course of 30 minutes or so for flights of 200 or 300 people. And so there is a reason why terrorists value passports from Britain, France, other visa waiver countries. It is not for nothing, for example, that Zacharias Moussaoui, the so-called 20th hijacker, had a French passport. It's not for nothing that Richard Reed, the shoe bomber, who is responsible for the fact that all of us have to take off our shoes now at airports, came on a British passport. And yet, both the Bush administration, in which I served, and the Obama administration, in which I served to a degree, I was the co-chairman of the transition team at the Department of Homeland Security for the Obama administration, so I bring a nonpartisan approach to Homeland Security. Both administrations have, rather than ratcheting back the visa waiver program, have expanded it. It was 27 countries in the Bush administration. It's now 36, with Greece having been added just the other day. Visa waiver status is regarded as a boon to countries for their support for our foreign policy as opposed to a potential means in which terrorists can exploit us. A quick word about intelligence, and then a quick word about counterterrorism strategy, and then I'll conclude with some concluding remarks, and I'll open it up for questions. A quick word about intelligence. If you have trouble sleeping at night, as all of us do from time to time, I would recommend that you pick up a copy of, not the healthcare legislation, but an equally voluminous bill that people have probably forgotten about, and that is the legislation that created the Department of Homeland Security, and turn to the intelligence section. If you do, I think you'll agree with me that if there was one reason why the Department of Homeland Security was created above all others, it was to get the intelligence part of Homeland Security right. Now, what do I mean by that? We now know, thanks largely to the work of the 9/11 Commission, that it is not as if we had too little information pointing to the 9/11 terror attacks. If anything, we had too much. We didn't know what we had. Our eavesdropping agency, the National Security Agency, intercepted, we now know, at least 2 messages before 9/11 pointing to the attacks. One message said, 0 hour is tomorrow. The other said the match is about to begin. But the problem is that neither message was translated, and their significance was not grasped until September 12th, one day too late. We also know that our watch lists were a mess. Part of the problem was that there wasn't one comprehensive, accurate, easily accessible watch list that federal officials and local law enforcement officials, like those here today, could access to determine whether the person standing before them was in fact a terrorist. For example, we know now that the CIA had watch listed 2 of the 9/11 hijackers, but they never bothered to share that information with the State Department. Had they done so, presumably the State Department would have denied those 2 terrorists a visa, and if there had been 17 hijackers rather than 19, who knows, maybe that would have been too few to carry out the plot. Once those 2 hijackers were in the country, had the CIA shared that information with the FBI, perhaps those 2 hijackers could have been found, because after all, we now know that those 2 hijackers were living openly in San Diego under their own names, and they were listed in the San Diego telephone book. And so, if you read the intelligence section of the Department of Homeland Security, 2 jobs were given to the Department of Homeland Security's intelligence apparatus. One, to synthesize the streams, the millions of gigabytes of Homeland Security-related threat information from across the intelligence community so that one department would have that information that could be accessible to everybody, and also to consolidate these dozen or so terror watch lists into one actionable list. But inexplicably, in the weeks following the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, the Bush administration gave the task of synthesizing intelligence information, took it away from the Department of Homeland Security, and instead gave it to the entity that had it to start with, the Central Intelligence Agency. A new agency was created called the Terrorist Threat Integration Center. It's now called the National Counterterrorism Center. It's headed by a very able fellow whom I visited just the other day, but the point is the CIA is still in charge of synthesizing terror-related information, and let's face it, the CIA failed at that task on 9/11. The job of consolidating the terror watch lists, likewise, was taken away in the weeks after 9/11, in the weeks after the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, from the Department of Homeland Security, and given to an FBI-led entity called the Terrorist Screening Center. So the two agencies, to the extent any agencies were in charge of predicting and preventing a 9/11, the CIA and the FBI are still in charge of it, and this new Department of Homeland Security that by its very name is charged with preventing another 9/11 is the red-headed stepchild, as it were, to mix metaphors, with its nose pressed against the glass, looking in. And now largely, the Department of Homeland Security's role is limited to taking whatever intelligence crumbs the rest of the federal intelligence apparatus is willing to share with the Department of Homeland Security and disseminating that to state and local officials. And we can ask our state and local law enforcement officials how good a job the Department of Homeland Security is doing in sharing intel with them and with private sector owners and operators of critical infrastructure. A final word about perhaps the most important aspect of things, and that is counterterrorism strategy. I don't know whether any one of you is a fan or a foe of Secretary Rumsfeld, but there is no question but that he is very, very bright and very, very analytical. And I was struck by a memo that he sent in 2004 at the height of the Iraq War that was intended just for internal consumption, shared just with his top advisors. And he wondered aloud in this memo one Saturday afternoon whether we could actually ultimately kill and capture our way out of terrorists, whether we were making more terrorists in the process of killing and capturing them. And that is ultimately the key question. Of course there is a role for the military to play in countering terrorism. Of course there is a role for law enforcement to play. But what we have yet to figure out is how to stop the terrorist production line at its source. That is ultimately a struggle, the hardest struggle, for the hearts and minds of people. What is it about someone that causes them to become so radicalized, so extreme in their views, to pervert a religion, and to use that perversion to kill and to injure as many people as possible? We only dimly understand the radicalization process, and our government is beginning to get its arms around it. But we must think about the nature of the terrorism threat. I would argue that we really have the worst of all possible worlds now. On the one hand, we still have what's called Al-Qaeda Central. Bin Laden, Zawahiri, the leaders of Al-Qaeda, determined to strike the United States again. Are they on the run on the borders of Afghanistan and Pakistan, as the CIA director said the other day? Absolutely they are. The Bush administration commendably dramatically increased over time the use of drones on the Afghan-Pakistan border to take out top-level Al-Qaeda leaders. If anything, the Obama administration has expanded upon that. The number of drone strikes has increased sixfold over the course of a single year. We've taken out at least 20 top Al-Qaeda operatives. But the question that Rumsfeld posed remains the same, and that is, are we making more terrorists than we're able to kill and capture? And that's why we must redouble our efforts to complement our military and law enforcement efforts with political efforts, with economic efforts, with sociocultural efforts to fill the void in people's lives that causes them to radicalize themselves and that poses a threat to the United States. In the old days, and I'll conclude with this, our two oceans protected us. We could afford to be ignorant of the rest of the world. We could afford to be indifferent to the rest of the world. But whatever instability exists abroad can ultimately have a direct and consequential impact on us here at home. That old saw about a butterfly flapping its wings in the Amazon having effects on the weather patterns here in Aspen couldn't be truer when it comes to counterterrorism. And so going forward, it's the civilians, it's each of us average Americans who has as important a role to play in homeland security and counterterrorism as those who are privileged to serve in government at the federal level, the state level, and the local level. Why don't I leave it there and leave the rest of the time for questions? And again, I'm grateful to all of you for being here, and thank you very much.
What is your feeling about what is considered politically incorrect profiling?
The question is, and I'll repeat it in case those of you in the back didn't hear it, is what is my feeling about what is called profiling?
Yeah, and extended to that question also, would you recommend that all countries, because a French passport or English passport is not as scrutinized, that all visitors to the U.S. have in-person visa applications?
Right, and the added question is, would I recommend that all people, not just the visa waiver travelers, have their passports scrutinized and be subjected to the same scrutiny as visa waiver travelers? The answer to the first question is, what is my view about profiling, is that there really are two issues to this. What's politically correct, as you said, and what's effective in terms of a counterterrorism strategy. Of course, profiling on racial or ethnic grounds is politically incorrect. There's no question about that. That said, I would argue it's also counterproductive, and that's the most important thing as a counterterrorism tactic. You know, we all have, whether we admit it or not, I think, I do, in our minds, a particular stereotype of what a terrorist looks like. He looks like Osama bin Laden. He looks like Zacarias Moussaoui. That said, these two latest terror scares with Jihad Jane and Pauline Ramirez, just a week ago later, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, classic American stereotypes, women, not men, defies the stereotype that we all have of terrorists, and it underscores the point I'm making, and that is, from leaving political correctness aside, it is counterproductive as a counterterrorism tactic to focus on one particular race, one particular ethnicity, because terrorists know what our stereotype is in our minds, and they are recruiting people who don't fit that stereotype. As to whether I think that the same scrutiny should be applied to non-visa travelers, including Americans, people on American passports, as those regarding visa waiver travelers, I do. In fact, rather controversially, I've called for jettisoning, for doing away with the visa waiver program. And I realize the draconian consequences that would have. Of course, there would be a huge budgetary impact. We'd have to dramatically increase the number of State Department personnel in order to process all those applications. We'd have to do that, otherwise the lines would be very backed up. And the last thing, let me underscore, I think we Americans can afford to do is throw up walls and discourage people from coming to our country. We've done that before, and we've seen the consequences of it. That said, as I said before, the visa waiver program is really an open invitation for terrorists to visit the United States, and so I think that we need to crack down on both visa waiver travelers and those from non-visa waiver countries, and I would, in fact, do away with the visa waiver program altogether. Yes, ma'am.
You know, why don't we do something about Saudi Arabia? Wouldn't you say that Saudi Arabia really has created a lot of the problems? They have madrasas all over the world, I believe. And they teach such radicalism, and yet somehow, inexplicably, they're our friends. Why don't we go after Saudi Arabia? Why are we so, we just seem to avoid it? And Saudi Arabia, I think, is a culprit.
Right. The question is, what about Saudi Arabia? There appears to be Saudi support for teaching radicalism all throughout the world. But there is, in fact, I agree with you. I completely agree with you. And so why do we have the policy with regard to Saudi Arabia that we have? You're quite right. It's not a question of appearance. There are madrasas not just around the world. There are madrasas in the United States. There are madrasas in Northern Virginia, not very far from where I live in Washington, D.C., that teach the same kind of vitriol. And the answer as to why we haven't cracked down on the Saudis to the extent that we should is because we are overly dependent upon the Saudis for our energy. And that's why ultimately all of these issues are linked. Energy independence, I would argue, is a national security imperative. It's not just an energy or environment imperative. The reason that we are as invested in the Middle East and the Persian Gulf as we are is, there's no question about it. It's because of our economic dependence on it. And that's why I think we need to redouble our efforts with that regard. But we also need to call out the Saudi government to the extent of its being really two-faced about this. On the one hand, the Saudi government argues that they're supportive of our counterterrorism strategy, and to some degree they are. They have gone after terrorists who use Saudi Arabia as a safe haven. They have de-radicalization programs in Saudi Arabia that have proved effective, and we are attempting to adopt some of those elements in our own de-radicalization programs. But there is no question but that there are very influential people in Saudi Arabia who are directly financing terrorism, and the Saudi government turns a blind eye to it.
One other thing, why aren't we energy independent? There's a lot of corruption involved in our government on both sides of the divide, I might add.
Right.
So why isn't that addressed? You know,
well,
energy independence is really very lame at this point, and it's really very discouraging that we're not further along in that process. We're feeding terrorism, and then we're sending our men in to fight it.
Right.
And that is really absurd.
The follow-up is, why aren't we farther along? in terms of energy independence. And I think it's really two reasons. I mean, this is a huge, huge topic in itself, obviously, and I should largely leave that to my energy colleague in Washington, David Monsma. But I think, in short, the answer is, and I telegraphed this in my talk, and that is we Americans are really short-term thinkers. We're very crisis-driven. We focused on energy independence in the 1970s. I'm old enough to remember that. I was in high school. When we saw those long gas lines, we got serious about it. We were beginning to get serious about it again a couple of summers ago when gas prices shot up and the lines began to form, but we're back to status quo here in the country. And the second point is, until there is a clear line that can be drawn between one issue and another, it's very difficult for Americans conceptually to get their arms around it. No one has really drawn the clear line between the terrorism threat and our lack of energy independence. And until that's done, Americans, average Americans, won't see the urgency of putting pressure on their leaders to do something about it. Yes?
Isn't there a danger that we can focus so much on security and safety that we lose the very nature of our society, that we lose our openness? I travel a lot around the world, and wouldn't there be a great risk that if we did away with the visa waiver program, sure, we kept out terrorists, but we also keep out thousands and thousands of good-willing people that could be friendly and supportive and cooperative with the United States?
Right.
Where is the dividing line, and how do we balance it?
I think that's a very good question indeed. And basically the question is, where is the dividing line between security and liberty? Don't we run the risk of divesting ourselves of our liberty in the headlong rush to make ourselves as secure as we can be? And I really wrestle with this question, and I guess I have a number of responses. One is, as I said, we have to be concerned about the foreign policy implications of a move like getting rid of the visa waiver program. That's why, as I said, I would, to counter that, to mitigate it somewhat, significantly, I would dramatically increase the number of State Department personnel, the State Department's budget, so we could process those applications quickly. If there's a tremendously long line, obviously, that would be a deterrent to travel in the United States. The Department of Homeland Security also needs to do a better job of presenting a welcoming face to people coming from the rest of the world. People who are unnecessarily hassled, who are not terrorists, whom watch lists don't show to be terrorists, should not be subjected to these measures because it sends an ugly image to the rest of the world that can be counterproductive. There's no question. And I'm reminded of that very eloquent statement that George Kennan made at the conclusion of that legendary Telegram X, where he talked about the nature of the Soviet threat and laid out a strategy, the strategy of containment, to defeat it. And toward the end of that cable, he said that ultimately, to paraphrase, only if we became like the Soviet Union could we be defeated. Only if we became like them. And we must be constantly aware of that danger. And so where is the line between security and liberty? Let me explain, I'll try to be short about this, where I draw the line. To me, every security measure ought to be evaluated by what I think is a very simple calculus, and that is whether the increase in security occasioned by that measure is outweighed by the diminution in liberty. And let me give you two extremes. One is, I talked about taking off shoes. Everybody thinks that's a hassle. But I would argue that that's a relatively minor hassle and one that I'm willingly happy to undergo if it can prevent the next Richard Reed from blowing up an airplane. At the other end of the spectrum is the story we all read in, I think it was USA Today several years ago, that the NSA, the eavesdropping agency, was attempting to get not just a record of telephone calls between known or suspected terrorists abroad and Americans here in this country. Of course, we want copies of those telephone calls. We want our government to listen to those telephone calls. But further, NSA was trying to get a record of every single call in the United States without any suspicion of terrorism. Now, to me, that is a huge diminution in liberty for a very, very tiny, if any, gain whatsoever in security. Intelligence is always like finding the needle in a haystack. To my mind, that measure only piles more hay on the stack and makes it even more difficult for counterterrorism officials to do their job. So it seems to me that's where the line should be drawn between security and liberty, and I'm urging the government to use that calculus. Yes?
In that same vein, the man that was on Christmas Eve, supposedly he was on the watch list. So when you talk about this big watch list, what does that mean actually? Because there were many, many conversations, I mean, even his own parents, there was pretty, where does that list go? And
Right.
then you talk about the new system that's going to be coming in that they're going to be able to do body searches? How much does that cost? How many millions of dollars? And what would happen at the airport if you put in your thing and you see that you're wanted, as many of those 19 were, even for driving?
Right.
They were. So where does that go, and how much?
Right. The first question was about the watch list. You know, what's the efficacy of it, really, essentially, is your question. If this fellow on Christmas Day, Abdul Muttalib, was on the watch list, and yet he obviously was able to get through. And I think the short answer to that is, obviously, the watch list process is still very much a work in progress. And that's inexcusable all these many years after 9/11. The fact that Abdul Muttalib's, not just anybody, but his own father went off the street, physically came into our embassy in Abuja in Nigeria, and talked to not one government agency there, the State Department, but two government agencies. He talked to the CIA officials there too. And he followed up those in-person meetings with, as I understand it, two written communications as well. And yet, we still have counterterrorism officials in our government who think that that was insufficient to focus on him. They say that people come into our embassy all the time and file missing persons reports or say something bad about their relatives. This wasn't any person. This was his father. It wasn't any father. He was a respected Nigerian banker and former government official. And just think of how difficult it is to essentially turn in your own child because you're concerned about the impact that that child could have if he carries out a terror attack in the United States. And so it just shows that these watch lists are ultimately tools, and they in and of themselves are not sufficient. We know that the State Department actually did a database search for his name, but they misspelled it, and that's why they didn't find him in the database. And so the information is only as good as the people who are using it. The second question is how much of these whole body imaging machines cost, and the answer is they cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. The machines themselves do. And further, they will require a threefold increase in the number of screeners. We've got about 45,000 screeners. There are going to have to be 3 additional screeners hired to man those whole body imagers. And the main point is, once we deploy them fully in the country, they won't detect the next Abdul Muttalib. And that is so typical of our approach to Homeland Security.
Time out. I'm ready to crawl under the table and go like this. Where there has to be context between the threat of, now obviously you're a fireman and you look at all the houses that are burning. Like quite a few houses are burning, there are millions of houses that are not burning. The Brits have been dealing with this thing for 40 years. Where is the rationale for the amount of work that we're doing to prevent how many possible events that interfere with our life, pursuit of happiness, etc., as compared to walking on the golf course and getting hit by lightning,
Right.
or having an earthquake take out X number of people, or having a train crash in Los Angeles, having a train crash there. How do we put that in context so that we can realize that after everything is said and done, the threat to our persons from a terrorism attack is maybe 1,000% of anything else that happens.
Right.
Please address it.
I'm glad that you asked that question. The question essentially is the probability of terrorism, based on all statistical analysis that anyone has ever done or seen, is very, very low. And yet we're investing billions of dollars. We have a huge government apparatus to prevent the threat of terrorism. Do we have this in balance? Is the context right? I'm very glad you asked this question. There is a scholar, I will call him, at Ohio State, John Muller, who makes precisely this argument. And I have a running debate with John about just this. There is no question but that, at least based on historical evidence, which is, of course, all the evidence we have, that the probability of any terror attack is low. But to my mind, we have to focus on the next part of the equation. That is, the consequences of any terror attack that succeeds are very high. And further, the nature of terrorism. Of course, more people are killed every day by cancer or automobile accidents or deer crossing the road than the number of people who die in terror attacks. But if 50 people die tomorrow in a terror attack, and 50 people die tomorrow in a cancer, a particular kind of cancer in a particular location, which will be on the front page of our newspapers? It's the terror attack. And the reason is because of the psychological nature of terror. The fact that anyone, at any time, can be killed for a political agenda over which any given American citizen has absolutely no control, may or may not agree with that agenda, but in any event has no control, has a terrorizing effect on the populace that deaths that happen in the ordinary course of human events do not. So it's the nature of it. And the second point is the fact that Al-Qaeda, anyway, the most serious terrorists, do pose, ultimately, an existential threat to the United States. They are seeking, we know, to acquire nuclear weapons, biological weapons, chemical weapons, that, if they succeed in it, could kill tens of millions of Americans. And so it just underscores, as I said, the probability is definitely low, but the consequences psychically and the consequences materially, if they succeed in acquiring weapons of mass destruction, are outsized, and therefore I think outsized measures are required to deal with it. That said, in response to the other question, I think we have to make sure that we balance security against liberty, and to me, that can be done if you use the calculus that I'm proposing. Yes?
Of course, we know about the psychological impact of a 9/11, and that's why the aviation industry has had all the focus, it seems. But what are we doing about protecting our ports? What are we doing about protecting our chemical plants? What are we doing about protecting our nuclear power plants in this country?
The question is, of course, we know that terrorists can attack airplanes, but what about all these other sectors, ports and critical infrastructure like chemical plants, etc.? You're quite right. As I said, we tend to fight the last war. We make sure that that terrorists are not successful in attacking us in the very same way that they did the last time. But we have not focused the attention that we should focus, I would argue, in ports. It's not just the cargo containers I was talking about. Small boats is a huge potential problem. The coal, for example, was blown up in 2001, in October of 2001. The number of small boats in ports and harbors around the country is hundreds of thousands, and we know nothing about them. Critical infrastructure. One of the unique things about America is that critical infrastructure, like the electricity grid, like our cyber networks, like chemical plants, are owned or operated 85% or more by the private sector. And so the government must work in partnership with the private sector to regulate these sectors to reduce the threat to the maximum possible degree. And the problem is, absent a mandate from government, I'm exaggerating a little bit to make the point, of course, but generally speaking, absent a mandate from government to do something about this threat, industry won't do it. And that's particularly true, and understandably so, I'd argue, in these tight budgetary times. We saw some watered-down chemical plant regulations in the Bush administration, and those have not been strengthened significantly by the Obama administration. I worry a lot about our cyber networks. I read just yesterday that there are 1.8 billion, with a B, cyber attacks each month on our government networks. And we don't really understand fully the physical consequences of a successful cyber attack. Think of the people who would be killed and injured by a cyber attack that was focused on critical nodes like our healthcare system. And so you're quite right. We haven't paid adequate attention to things beyond aviation. And I'm afraid that we won't do so unless and until we are attacked in those sectors too, because that's the American tendency. Yes, in the back.
I'd like to bring it back home for a second. We Aspenites enjoy our lifestyle here very much, and I see that we have members of the police force in the room. And so I'm wondering about your opinion regarding, we have a lot of high-profile folks in Aspen. We have a lot of high-profile events throughout the year. And how concerned should we be, or are we, regarding former presidents and current elected leaders that come regularly through our little community to this kind of terrorist action?
Right. Well, I guess I'd say a couple of things about that. Basically, the question is, how concerned should we be, should people in Aspen be about the threat of assassination against high-profile people here in Aspen, political leaders generally, I think is a fair synopsis of the question. And I guess I'd say a couple of things. First of all, assassination is a very, very simple tactic. It is striking to me that Al-Qaeda has not attempted, apparently, to use assassination as a counterterrorism tool. We saw the havoc, the fear, the terrorism that the John Malveaux shootings caused in the Washington area a few years ago. And that was so easy to do, and it was so difficult to catch those two people who carried out those attacks. We've seen assassinations from time to time, really, but really never for counterterrorism purposes or for terrorism purposes here in the United States. It would be shockingly easy to do. I would also say that, of course, the Secret Service, which is part of the Department of Homeland Security, will tell you on the record that the number of threats against this president, of course, are exponentially higher than against previous presidents for obvious reasons. So there are garden variety criminals, and there are terrorists, surely, also, who are studying the possibility of carrying out that kind of assassination. And I guess the third thing that I'd say is that as to Aspen itself, and places like Aspen around the country, and when I say like Aspen, I don't mean exactly like Aspen. I don't think there's any place exactly like Aspen. But I mean places that one wouldn't think of as a terror threat. One of the things that's been striking to me also is that we've seen terror attacks in New York. We've seen terror attacks in Washington. That makes sense, obviously. Those are two very large cities. New York's our cultural capital, our financial capital. Washington is our political capital. To me, to talk about the terrorizing, the psychological impact of terrorism, it would be more shocking, would cause even more havoc if there were a terror attack in Omaha, Nebraska, or in Topeka, Kansas. And further, if a terror attack were carried out not on a government building or a Wall Street investment bank, but instead on a shopping mall or a movie theater, the way attacks routinely happen in Israel and to a lesser degree Britain. That's not yet happened, but the latest from our counterterrorism officials is they're very concerned that Al-Qaeda may now be focusing less on these huge, spectacular attacks that we saw on 9/11 and more on these kinds of one-off, easy attacks that are much easier to carry out. I've often been asked, why hasn't there been another 9/11? And my answer is, it's not just the work of our counterterrorism officials and some luck, but also it's the scale of Al-Qaeda's ambitions. I think, and they've said this on the record, they want the next attack to be at least as spectacular and ideally more spectacular than 9/11, and that takes a lot of work to plan and pull it off. But now we see signs that they want to carry off that success and that killing people is even more important to them now than the spectacular nature of the attack. And so really that's the worst of all possible worlds. So perhaps coming soon to a theater near you. Yes?
Two questions, please. One about the CIA, one about Mr. Rumsfeld. You made reference to that Saturday afternoon when Mr. Rumsfeld had that communicator memoranda to his advisors asking, are you creating more terrorists by trying to catch or kill them? Was there a response from the advisors backing him on that? And then follow-up question after that.
Sure. The question was that Rumsfeld memo that I mentioned back in 2004, to my knowledge, was there a response from his advisors to his question as to whether we're making more terrorists than we're killing or capturing? To my knowledge, there really wasn't an answer to him. And I think it's clear that there wasn't an answer because I think our efforts to get at the terror mindset and to counter the terrorist influence are still very much a work in progress 6 years later. So whether there was a written answer, whether there was a formal answer or not, as a practical matter, it seems to me that the question is still incomplete. And the follow-up?
The second one is, you mentioned the administration took the task of synthesizing data from HSA and gave it to CIA. Did they address the dissemination of that data once they figured out what they had and the impact on the country or the world? Because I know being within government, agencies like to maintain what they figure out themselves and possess it. CIA doesn't have a good reputation as being a sharer. I'm wondering if that dissemination was addressed when they gave them the task.
Right. The follow-up question was, what about information sharing? In the giving of the job of synthesizing terror information to the CIA, was there an effort to make sure that that information was subsequently shared, as it should be, with state and local law enforcement, essentially is the question?
State, local, FBI, State Department, our border?
Other agencies, right, other elements of government, and also the private sector. And the answer is that information sharing is still very much a work in progress. As you said, the CIA in particular, and the federal intelligence community in general, is very jealous of its prerogatives. Its information, its intelligence, obviously are its crown jewels. And they are rightly, to be fair to them, I don't mean to satirize them, they are quite rightly concerned about sources and methods. That said, I think that the government as a whole has not done a good job of putting into the hands of state and local law enforcement and into the hands of the private sector the intelligence it needs to prevent the next attacks. I've always said that there's no such thing as an attack on America, a terror attack on America. An attack on America happens necessarily in a city. A terror attack happens in New York. It could happen in Omaha, Nebraska, as I said. And that's why local law enforcement officials and local private sector owners and operators need to have access to that intelligence to the same degree that the intelligence community does. And that is still not happening. Now, there are these fusion centers around the country, as I'm sure you know, which are a conglomeration of federal and state agencies and sometimes private sectors, operators, agents, who have some intelligence feed from the intelligence community. But that's still very much a work in progress, and I would argue it's still an incomplete job.
Point of order. The CIA was formed, and the law specifically determined that the CIA could not function within the United States. Is that correct?
It is, but I'm really not talking about functioning in the United States. If by function you mean carrying out covert activities in the United States. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about, and I think what you were talking about, is sharing information as to the nature of terror threats. And it certainly is legally authorized to do that, and I would argue legally obliged to do that, along with the rest of the intelligence community. Yes?
In light of your comment about larger terrorist events, what about things like sporting events or entertainment events where there could be 60 to 100,000 people?
Right.
What can we do about that?
What about sports arenas, and restaurants, and shopping malls, and movie theaters? Those are what I call soft targets. We have seen examples of the vulnerability of soft targets around the world. Those Mumbai attacks I mentioned in 2008, those were attacks not just on the mass transit system in Mumbai, but also, people forget now, on the Marriott Hotel in Mumbai. And so, these soft targets are very vulnerable. We have nothing like, needless to say, the counterterrorism apparatus in sports stadiums or restaurants or shopping malls that we have in airports or even in port facilities. The Israelis do, of course, and that's because, sadly, the Israelis understand that, based on their history, they are under constant threat. We are unlikely to see the imposition of anything like that in this country unless and until there is an attack on a Marriott hotel in the United States, or unless and until there is an attack on a restaurant in the United States. But I'm afraid to say that that day is coming precisely because it's so easy to do, and precisely because, as I said, Al-Qaeda now seems more intent, based on the intelligence that we've been able to obtain from them, on success than scale. Maybe two others? Yes?
Is there any intelligence that is gathering the non-terrorist type of Muslims in America who can speak the language? When they say one thing on it this way, it really means this. So isn't there a way we could go to, isn't Dearborn, Michigan, have a whole lot of smart Muslims that are not terrorists and want to kill for, and can't you get them together and say, and have them gather people all over the world and say, we are going to stop this?
Right.
Because nobody else can.
Very good question. That is, what about Muslims out there who don't subscribe to this deadly ideology? Can't they be enlisted to fight terrorism here in this country and abroad? And I think that's an excellent question, and one that I think is very important. I was just this past week, I think it was exactly a week ago, testifying before the House Intelligence Subcommittee of the Homeland Security Committee, chaired by Jane Harman, Aspenite, and we were focused on just that issue, countering violent extremism. And the good news is, the vast majority of Muslim Americans, like all Americans, are as opposed to terrorism as the rest of us are. If anything, they're more opposed to it because it's their community, it's their religion that's being perverted. And as you said, it is they have more credibility than the rest of us do, than non-Muslims do, in condemning this, precisely because we are non-Muslims and they are Muslims. And so the good news is that there are communities like Dearborn, Michigan, like Houston, Texas, where I come from. It's a very cosmopolitan place, like Los Angeles and like New York, where the FBI, local law enforcement officials, the Department of Homeland Security at the federal level are working with the Muslim community to do just that. The Department of Homeland Security has a terrific program in that regard, and New York Police Department, for example, has done a terrific job of taking as a strength the diversity of the city of New York, and there are at least 600 people in the ranks of the New York Police Department who come from the Muslim community and who know the community best. And so we need to do more of that. And that's what I mean when I say we need to get ahead of the terrorist production curve. I think the key to doing it is to identify those Muslims who can help us get the message out. Maybe the final question, Gary?
Yes, I'm curious as to how you think we're doing
our intelligence community is doing as it relates to understanding our enemies, understanding the Muslim world, understanding the language of the Arabic or Farsi. For some time, I think we really haven't had enough experts in that field. I wonder where we are today as opposed to 9/11.
The question from Gary is, and final question is, how good a job is government doing of understanding the Muslim community, of understanding the language, of understanding the culture? And I think the answer to that is, it's still very much a work in progress, but efforts are underway. I talked a second ago about NYPD, and I have huge regard for what Commissioner Ray Kelly has done in that regard, assisted by the head of the intelligence unit in NYPD. NYPD uniquely in this country has a mini CIA in the New York Police Department. And they have some, I said 600 officers who come from the Muslim community who speak Farsi, who speak Urdu, who speak Pashto, who speak Arabic, and who speak the various dialects spoken in key parts of the world about which there is concern. And they have relationships with mosques around the country. They have relationships with community organizations. And that's why, for example, we've seen evidence in certain communities, Minnesota, for example, where the Somali community, there is a rising threat of insider terrorists from the Somali community, where concerned parents in the Somali community went to members of the Somali community in Minneapolis who were part of local law enforcement there, said they were concerned about the radicalism of their children, and those young Somalis were found before they were able to carry out a terror attack in Somalia or here in the United States. And so we're getting there. But we need to recognize that this ethnic and racial diversity, cultural diversity, is a strength rather than a weakness. And the vast majority of Muslims are opposed to terrorism, and we need to enlist them in this counterterrorism fight. That, at the end of the day, is the answer to Mr. Rumsfeld, it seems to me. Why don't I leave it there and close with a little plug. Crystal began with one, so let me end with one. I'd be remiss if I didn't do it. Shameless self-promoter as I am. That, as you heard, we are building on the phenomenal success of the Aspen Ideas Festival, with which you all are familiar, I know, and companion programs, like programs, shorter, smaller, for the Aspen Environment Forum and the Aspen Health Forum, focused on the environment and health. There will now be, this summer, June 28 to July 1st, the first annual Aspen Security Forum, focused exclusively on these issues of Homeland Security and counterterrorism. We have a terrific lineup of confirmed speakers. The Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mullen, will be here on opening night, June 28th, to talk about the nexus between the wars in Afghanistan and Pakistan and Homeland Security. Former Homeland Security Secretary Michael Chertoff and former White House Homeland Security Advisor Fran Townsend, the State Department's Ambassador at Large for Counterterrorism, Daniel Benjamin, the United Nations top terrorism expert, Richard Bennett, and I could go on and on, including Gary Hart, former senator from here in Colorado, and of course the chairman of the Prescient Hart-Rudman Commission. So I commend that to all of you, and I hope to see all of you on June 28th to July 1st back here in lovely Aspen. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
Very nice.
Very nice to see you.